It was a warm and unusually quiet Sunday afternoon. The kind where the breeze barely moved the leaves and you could hear the faint buzz of a lawnmower several houses down. I had just settled into my recliner with a fresh cup of coffee, the smell of roasted beans still swirling in the air. My phone was on silent, the front door locked, and the world beyond my windows felt miles away. I lived in a suburban gated community, the kind where everything was regulated by an overly assertive HOA. We had rules for mailbox height, for the shade of your house paint, even for how long your car could be parked on the street. But despite the overbearing policies, the neighborhood felt safe. Secure, even. So when there was a loud knock at the door around 2 p.m., it caught me off guard. Not the kind of light, polite knock you expect from a neighbor. This was firm, deliberate, and repeated. I froze for a second, listening. Another knock. Then came a voice, muffled but assertive. "Sir, HOA security. We need to speak with you. It's urgent." I wasn't expecting anyone. Certainly not anyone from the HOA on a Sunday. My instincts told me something was off, but curiosity pushed me to peek through the peephole. Two men stood outside. Both were in dark navy polos with an HOA security patch loosely stitched on the chest, khaki cargo pants, and black utility belts that looked more costume than regulation. One of them wore sunglasses even though we were standing in the shade of my front porch, while the other held a clipboard, looking around like he was waiting for someone to come out and challenge him. They looked official, sort of. Enough that someone in a hurry or not paying attention might just let them in. But I've lived here long enough to know our HOA doesn't have a security team that goes door to door. The most they ever do is hire a local patrol company to circle the blocks at night. These two weren't from any of those outfits. Still, I cracked the door just slightly, the chain lock still latched. "Yes," I asked. "Can I help you?" The man in sunglasses stepped forward immediately. "We've received a complaint from the HOA board. You're in violation of the community firearms storage policy. We need to inspect your gun safe. Please open the door." I blinked. "Firearms storage policy?" I repeated. "That's not something I've heard about." "It was added last quarter," said the one with the clipboard. "It's now mandatory for residents to have their gun safes registered with the HOA. We're authorized to collect codes to verify compliance." That's when the alarm bells really started ringing in my head. First of all, that policy didn't exist. I'd been at the last HOA meeting where the loudest argument was about bird feeders. Second, even if there were such a policy, the HOA would never send people around to demand access codes. That's a legal and privacy nightmare. And third, these guys were too eager, too rehearsed. I narrowed my eyes and said nothing for a moment. The man in sunglasses took a half step closer. "We don't have time to debate this," he said. "Either you provide the safe code or we notify local law enforcement." I held back a laugh. These guys were bold. Stupidly bold. But it was also clear they were fishing for someone gullible enough to comply. Maybe someone elderly or someone intimidated by a uniform. Their outfits were just convincing enough to fool the average resident who didn't know better. But I wasn't that guy. What they didn't know, and what made this situation even more surreal, was that I had two Navy SEALs staying with me for the weekend. Old friends in town for a veterans event. At that moment, they were inside, probably in the living room watching TV or stretching out after a morning run. They had arrived late the previous night, and I hadn't expected anyone to knock, so I hadn't even mentioned them yet. I kept the door chained and asked, "Do you have identification?" Clipboard guy lifted his badge, a flimsy laminated card that had HOA Patrol written in all caps with no name, no signature, not even a logo I recognized. Sunglasses guy just shrugged. "We're authorized, sir." "Don't make this harder than it needs to be." The way he said it sent a chill down my spine. Not because I was scared, but because it confirmed this was a bluff, one wrapped in fake authority and a hope that I'd fold. I stayed quiet a beat longer, then slowly shut the door without another word. Through the door, I could hear one of them mutter, "He's gonna call someone. We should move." But they didn't leave. Not yet. The moment I shut the door, I took a deep breath and locked the deadbolt. My mind was racing. Whoever those guys were, they weren't legitimate and their urgency was starting to escalate. I didn't know if they were armed or just desperate, but I knew this wasn't about HOA regulations. This was about getting inside my home and more specifically into my gun safe. From behind the safety of the door, I listened carefully. They hadn't left. In fact, I could still hear one of them pacing on the porch. His footsteps moved back and forth across the wooden boards. I stepped away from the door quietly and reached for my phone. No calls yet. No voicemails. No HOA email about inspections. Nothing. just as I expected. But before I could send a text or make a call, there was another loud knock, harder this time, more forceful. "Sir, we're not going to ask again," the voice boomed. "You need to comply with HOA protocol. We have the right to enforce the firearm policy for the safety of the neighborhood." I didn't respond. Instead, I opened the group chat with my two house guests, Brian and Kyle, both former Navy SEALs who had seen more action in a month than most cops did in a lifetime. I typed quickly, "Two guys out front. Fake HOA. Asking for gun safe code. Not leaving. Might escalate." I heard movement from down the hallway. A door opened. Footsteps. Brian's voice was low. "What's going on?" I nodded toward the door and handed him my phone without saying anything. He scanned the message, then peered through the side window discreetly, keeping his body out of sight. After a second, he turned back toward Kyle, who had now joined us in the hallway. "They're still out there," Brian said. "And they're nervous. Probably armed." Kyle raised an eyebrow. "They asked for the gun safe code?" "Yeah," I said. "Claimed it's part of HOA enforcement." "Total bull." Brian gave a quiet scoff. "These guys are amateurs, but dangerous ones." While they started strategizing, I turned my attention back to the front. Outside, the man with the sunglasses was now standing closer to the door. I could hear him talking loudly, trying to apply pressure. "Sir, if you don't open the door and comply, we'll be forced to call in additional enforcement. You have 10 seconds to cooperate." That was the moment I realized they weren't just trying to intimidate, they were trying to provoke. They were pushing me to panic, to open the door, to give them what they wanted. And what they wanted clearly was access to firearms. These weren't burglars looking for jewelry or electronics. This was targeted. They knew or assumed I had weapons inside, and they wanted them fast. Maybe to sell, maybe to use. Either way, it made them more desperate than your average scammer. And that desperation was starting to show. The man with the clipboard suddenly stepped off the porch and walked toward my driveway. I heard the gravel crunching beneath his boots. Then came the sound of something metal, possibly checking the side gate or trying the garage. The guy in sunglasses remained near the front door, still posturing. He knocked again, this time with something solid, maybe a flashlight or a tool. The sound rang through the hall, sharp and deliberate. "Last warning," he shouted. "We will enter by force if needed." I turned to Brian and Kyle. Both were now standing quietly, calm but alert, scanning through the windows. Brian had already moved to the side entry where he could get a clear look without being seen. Kyle pulled out his phone and began recording. These two weren't about to let things spiral without proof. They knew how important documentation was, especially in confrontations where the story could be twisted later. "They're bluffing," Brian said calmly. "But they're getting more reckless. They're not going to leave empty-handed." Back at the front door, I could hear the guy muttering into what sounded like a walkie-talkie. Maybe he was pretending. Maybe he had backup. I didn't know. But I did know this: these men weren't acting alone. This wasn't some spur-of-the-moment scheme. It felt planned, at least partially. They had props, fake IDs, fake uniforms, and just enough HOA lingo to throw off someone who wasn't paying attention. And now they were growing impatient. Every second they didn't get access to that gun safe, they grew louder, angrier, and more unstable. Inside the house, things were quiet but tense. Brian and Kyle had taken up positions near the windows, keeping watch without being seen. I stayed near the hallway, my phone in hand, recording everything I could hear. The two men outside were still pacing, still posturing like they were on some sort of official duty, but their act was starting to crack. They had gone from calm and professional to loud and impatient in less than 10 minutes. That alone told me everything I needed to know. They weren't trained and they weren't in control of the situation. From the front window, I got my first real good look at them without the distortion of the peephole. The man with the sunglasses was sweating. His posture had changed. He kept adjusting the radio clip to his belt even though it didn't seem to be doing anything. His shirt was wrinkled and his badge hung slightly crooked. The man with the clipboard had walked back from the driveway and was now whispering something to his partner. They were nervous, whispering quickly and scanning the neighborhood. It was a Sunday afternoon, so not many people were out, but I knew it wouldn't take much for a neighbor to look through their window and start asking questions. What really stuck out now was how their entire presence felt off. Their behavior didn't match the image they were trying to project. Real security doesn't knock like that. Real enforcement doesn't threaten you through your own front door and demand access to a personal gun safe without paperwork, a warrant, or proper identification. These guys had skipped all that. No clipboard forms with names. No printed notice from the HOA. Just fake uniforms and a story they thought would scare someone into compliance. Brian whispered from his spot by the window, no tactical coordination. Their spacing is terrible. One guy keeps exposing his flank every time he walks off the porch. Kyle added, the badge is a printout. It's not even laminated right. No barcodes. No official seal. They were professionals. They had seen this kind of act before, people pretending to be something they weren't, using power they didn't have, bluffing until someone broke. Brian leaned toward me and asked quietly, what do you want to do? I didn't answer right away. My thoughts were stuck on the idea that these men were so bold, so committed to the role, they probably thought they had the perfect plan. But their confidence was leaking. Every movement they made, every word they spoke only deepened the cracks in their performance. Then came another clue. One of them pulled out a small folder and started flipping through what looked like papers. He held them up toward the door and spoke loudly again. We have documentation. This is a level 2 compliance check under HOA safety protocol. All firearm owners must disclose and verify their secure storage per Community Agreement 4.3. There was no such agreement. Not in this HOA. Not anywhere in the bylaws. I had read them cover to cover when I moved in. The most invasive clause had to do with exterior paint color reviews. There was nothing, absolutely nothing, that gave anyone the right to access a private gun safe. This was a total fabrication. But it was clever. They knew a little legal language. Enough to make someone question what they thought they knew. They had mixed bits of truth like firearm safety policies and neighborhood regulations with complete fiction to build a lie that sounded plausible. A lie that, if delivered with authority, could make someone panic. It made me wonder, had they done this before? Had they shown up at another house, delivered the same lines, and walked away with whatever they wanted? If so, they had picked the wrong house this time. One of them stepped away from the door again and began glancing toward nearby homes. He seemed unsettled, maybe realizing things weren't going to plan. The other one spoke up, this time with more aggression. Sir, this is your final opportunity to comply. If you refuse, we'll escalate the matter through proper channels. You're in violation. You could lose your HOA privileges. You could be fined. Don't make this harder on yourself. He rattled off those threats as if they were punishments that would scare someone into giving up personal rights. But it wasn't working. Not on me. Not on the guys inside who had served in war zones. The fear tactics, the posture, the fake authority, none of it checked out anymore. They had come in with a script, rehearsed and probably used before. But like any con, it only worked if the target didn't look too closely. And now, under scrutiny, every piece of their story was falling apart. As the situation outside grew more intense, I knew stalling was my only option. If I gave them nothing, they might back off or slip up. But if I panicked or made any sudden moves, things could spiral quickly. I needed to buy time to keep them talking while Brian and Kyle assessed the threat. The two men were still posturing outside, shifting between threats and demands, trying to act like they had authority. But behind their forced confidence, I could sense the cracks deepening. I stepped into the foyer and raised my voice just enough to be heard through the door. All right, I said, trying to sound confused but cooperative. Let me get my paperwork. I want to see if I have anything on this new policy you're talking about. There was a pause outside, followed by the sound of footsteps. One of the men replied, You don't need paperwork. We already have it on file. Just get the code. We're wasting time. I kept my voice calm. Yeah, just give me a second. I want to double check. That bought a few more moments. Inside, Brian was already making his way toward the hallway near the back door, scanning for other possible entry points. Kyle moved to the kitchen window, checking if the two men were being watched by anyone else, perhaps a third party waiting nearby. They weren't assuming these guys were alone anymore. This wasn't a random scam, it felt too specific, too focused on the gun safe. That meant planning, and planning often meant accomplices. While they moved silently through the house, I pretended to shuffle through drawers, opening and closing them with deliberate noise so the men outside would think I was searching for something. I even flipped a few pages in a binder, trying to make it sound convincing. My phone was in my pocket, and I carefully pulled it out and texted Brian again, still out front. Asking again for code. I'm stalling. Be ready. He didn't reply, but I saw his head briefly nod from the hallway. He had positioned himself behind the thin curtain that partially covered the side window. From there, he had a clear angle on both men without being visible. Kyle had already retrieved a small tactical flashlight with a built-in strobe from his gear bag and was silently signaling readiness from the corner of the kitchen. The next knock at the door was harder. A deep thud. The man was growing impatient again. "We're running out of time here, sir. This is a mandatory inspection. Non-compliance could be reported to local authorities. Do you understand that?" His tone had shifted. The fake professionalism was now edged with frustration. He wasn't just pretending to be in charge anymore. He was irritated that his bluff hadn't worked yet. That was good. Frustrated people made mistakes. They talked too much. They moved recklessly. And I wanted them agitated just long enough for the next phase to begin. I called back. "You said this was under what rule again?" "Section what?" Silence. Then some mumbling. The guy with the clipboard spoke up. "Section of 4.3b of the Community Security Agreement. You don't need to read it right now. You're already on the list for inspection." I couldn't help but smile. There was no 4.3b in our documents. They were making it up as they went. That made it even more important to keep pressing. The more lies they had to juggle, the more likely they were to trip. "Okay," I said, "let me just grab my folder. It's in the room with the safe." That sentence caught their attention. I heard the man repeat it back to his partner. He said it's in the room with the safe. He's going. I wasn't, of course. I didn't move at all. I stayed by the hallway watching Brian and Kyle prepare silently. Brian made a short motion with his hand, a silent countdown, then looked to me. Kyle was now behind a wall near the front entry. They had shifted from observation to action. I had done my part. I stalled them. Kept them engaged, kept them talking, kept them believing there was still a chance they'd walk away with what they wanted. But with every minute that passed, they had less control over the situation. What they didn't realize was that the moment I sent that first message to the SEALs, they had already lost. From the moment Brian gave that silent 3 count, everything shifted. The energy inside the house was focused, quiet, deliberate. Outside, the 2 imposters were still wrapped in their act, unaware that they were seconds away from being confronted by 2 men who had trained for situations far more dangerous than this. These guys might have fooled a few residents before, maybe even gotten away with it, but today they had picked the wrong house and the wrong host. Brian moved first. Silent as a shadow, he slipped out through the side door and cut around the house, staying low and hugging the wall. He knew the layout from the night before and had already clocked the blind spots and angles. Kyle gave him a 10-second lead, then positioned himself near the entryway, just out of view of the small window. From where he stood, he had a clear shot at the front porch the moment the door opened. The 2 of them didn't need to talk. Their coordination was clean, instinctive. Years of working in high-pressure environments had made everything second nature. The man with the sunglasses was still standing on the porch, peering through the front window and knocking now and then with the butt of what looked like a flashlight. The one with the clipboard had stepped a few feet away and was muttering something on his fake radio again. Neither of them saw Brian approach from the side, nor did they register the brief flash of movement that brought him up behind them like a whisper. Without warning, Brian stepped onto the porch and calmly said, "You boys want to explain who you are and what you're doing here?" The effect was immediate. Sunglasses guy spun around, startled, while clipboard guy stumbled back a step, completely thrown by the sudden appearance of someone who wasn't supposed to be there. They hadn't seen him coming. They weren't prepared for a confrontation. And they definitely weren't prepared for the calm, almost casual confidence in Brian's voice. "We're with HOA enforcement," sunglasses guy stammered, instinctively reaching for his badge again. "We're conducting a mandatory inspection." "No, you're not," Brian interrupted, stepping closer. "This neighborhood doesn't have field inspectors. There's no firearm policy that gives you access to private safes. That badge is fake, your uniform's a joke, and your radio isn't even turned on." He said it all without raising his voice, without making a move that could be seen as threatening. But the authority in his tone was undeniable. This wasn't a man bluffing. This was someone who knew exactly what he was dealing with and wasn't even remotely intimidated. Clipboard guy tried to recover. We were just following protocol. There's been some confusion." "There won't be any confusion in about 30 seconds, Brian replied. Before either of them could react, the front door opened. Kyle stepped out. No weapons, no yelling, just his presence. His size, his posture, the steady focus in his eyes. These weren't the reactions of homeowners or concerned citizens. These were the controlled movements of men trained to handle chaos with precision. Sunglasses guy backed up, hands slightly raised now. We don't want any trouble. You already brought trouble, Kyle said flatly. You came to this house demanding access to a safe. That's attempted coercion. Add impersonating security personnel and trespassing, and you've got a long afternoon ahead of you. They looked at each other. Nervous now. Uncertain. The act had completely fallen apart. No more confident threats. No more fake policies. Just two men who had overplayed their hand and were now standing face to face with people who knew how to dissect lies in seconds. Brian reached into his back pocket and pulled out his phone. We've got you on camera, he said. Everything you've said. Everything you've done. I'd suggest you sit down right there on the steps until law enforcement gets here. Clipboard guy opened his mouth to protest, then hesitated. They both knew they were caught. Their faces, their fake IDs, their voices, it was all recorded. And the two men standing before them weren't going to let them just walk away. There was a long pause as the two fakes stood frozen, not quite sure what to do next. Kyle took a step closer, his tone sharp now. You're done here. Sit down. Hands where we can see them. The tension on the porch had reached its peak. The two imposters were frozen in place, stuck between trying to save face and realizing they had zero leverage left. Brian and Kyle stood with quiet command, not threatening them with force but with presence alone. It was clear to everyone, especially the fake HOA cops, that the situation had spun completely out of their control. Sunglasses guy kept glancing around, probably hoping someone might intervene or give him a way out. But the neighborhood was still. Most homes had their blinds down, their residents unaware of the unfolding confrontation. Clipboard guy, now visibly sweating, slowly sat down on the front steps. His partner followed a second later. Neither of them looked so tough anymore. Without their fake titles and made-up authority to lean on, they just looked like two desperate men who had made a very poor decision. Brian stood to the side, phone still recording. He began calmly reading off a summary of the situation for the video. Time, date, location, description of the suspects, summary of the threats they made. It was clear he'd done this kind of report before. Kyle kept a firm eye on the two men, his arms crossed, never once lowering his guard. Inside, I was on the phone with the local sheriff's department. I gave them a brief summary, two individuals impersonating HOA security, attempting to gain access to a gun safe under false pretenses and currently being detained on my property. The dispatcher's tone shifted as soon as I mentioned the impersonation and the mention of firearms. She confirmed that a unit had already been dispatched and would be arriving shortly. I stepped out the front door, keeping behind Brian. The imposters wouldn't even look at me now. Their arrogance had evaporated. All that was left was shame and fear. Sunglasses guy muttered something about a misunderstanding, but Brian didn't even blink. He simply said, "Save it for the real cops." We didn't have to wait long. Within minutes, two squad cars pulled up to the curb. Lights flashing. Officers stepped out, one male, one female, hands near their belts but not drawn. They approached with practiced caution, scanning the scene. I stepped forward first, hands visible, and pointed toward the men on the steps. They claimed to be HOA security. Demanded access to my gun safe. No real ID. These two detained them. The officers exchanged a glance, then approached the seated men. Questions began, calm at first. Names, ID, reasons for being there. Clipboard guy tried to spin it, claiming they were performing a safety check authorized by the board. But the officers weren't buying it. The lack of real credentials, the suspicious story, the uniforms with no identifying numbers, it all fell apart fast. One of the officers asked to see the ID badges again. Brian handed over one of the fake ones and the officer shook his head almost immediately. "This isn't even state standard," he said. "No serial, no department number, no agency seal. Where'd you print this?" Neither of the men answered. Kyle handed over the phone with the video recording. The officer took one look at the footage and nodded. "All right," he said. "That's enough." The tone changed quickly. The two imposters were placed in handcuffs without resistance. The officer read them their rights as the other began searching them. No weapons, thankfully, but they did have a lockpicking kit, a stolen HOA flyer, and a list of several addresses, including mine, marked with handwritten notes. That part hit hard. This wasn't random. They had scoped this out. They had a plan. They may have even succeeded somewhere else before today. It was chilling to think about how close they came to fooling someone or how badly things could have gone if they had run into someone who panicked. One of the officers stepped aside to speak with Brian and Kyle, taking their statements and confirming their background. Once he understood who they were, the level of respect shifted. The officer thanked them both quietly, then looked back at me. "You're lucky these guys were here," he said. "And lucky you didn't open that door." I nodded, still trying to absorb the weight of it all. The officers loaded the two men into the squad cars, securing the evidence, and told me they'd be in touch with an official report. HOA cops fake.